I've never been one to believe in haunting stories. I always thought they were just made-up tales to scare children or entertain adults on dark nights. However, what happened to me that night in the abandoned building changed everything. I had been working as a night watchman for years, and it had been a quiet job until then. But what I saw and felt that night made me question everything I believed. The building in question was located on the outskirts of Manchester, an old commercial building that had been disused for decades. The imposing structure, with its broken windows and graffitied walls, was a monument to decay. I was ordered to keep an eye on the place because there were constant rumors of trespassers and vandals, but no one had ever found anything apart from a few rats and pigeons. I arrived at the building at around 10 p.m. The night was cold and the moonless sky made everything even gloomier. I parked my car near the entrance and, flashlight in hand, prepared myself for another boring night. From the first step inside the building, a strange sensation took hold of me. It was as if the air was denser, almost palpable. Ignoring the discomfort, I began my usual rounds, checking the doors and windows on the first floor. Right away, I noticed that something was different. The corridors, usually silent, seemed to be whispering. I heard moans, low and distant, but enough to make me stop and pay attention. I thought it might be the wind coming through the gaps in the broken windows, but the intensity and direction of the sounds changed constantly. I decided to go up to the second floor, where the moans seemed louder. The stairs were covered in dust and dirt, and the torchlight barely illuminated the path ahead. When I reached the top, an intense chill ran down my spine. I kept walking, passing locked doors and empty rooms, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. In one of the corridors, I noticed strange marks on the walls. They were deep scratches, as if something had tried to escape. My heart started beating faster, and I felt increasingly uncomfortable. The moans were now closer, almost within reach of my touch, but I still couldn't identify their origin. With every step I took, the feeling of being watched increased. It was as if invisible eyes were on me, analyzing my every move. I tried to remain calm and continue my rounds, but it was impossible to ignore the shadowy presence that seemed to be following me. At that moment, I realized that I was involved in something much bigger and more sinister than simple stories of trespassers. The abandoned building held secrets that were about to be revealed, and I didn't know if I was prepared to face whatever it was. That was the first time I felt real fear in my work. The kind of fear that makes your blood run cold and your mind question every sound, every shadow. And little did I know that the night had only just begun, and what awaited me was beyond my comprehension. The moans didn't stop, and every minute they seemed louder and more intense. Something inside me told me that I should run out of that place, but duty called. So I decided to investigate. I moved cautiously down the main corridor, trying to ignore the cold that enveloped me and the goosebumps that crawled across my skin. As I passed an abandoned room, I felt abnormally cold, as if I had crossed an invisible barrier. I stopped and looked around. The room was empty, except for a few broken chairs and a table covered in dust. The cold was so intense that my breath came out in clouds of steam. That wasn't normal. I thought there might be an open window, but they were all closed and sealed. I continued my rounds, but the feeling of being watched only increased. I felt as if shadows were moving around the edges of my vision, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I decided to go up another floor, believing that I could find some logical explanation for the moans and the cold. As I climbed, the moans became more frequent and louder, echoing through the empty corridors. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind began to imagine all sorts of things. Maybe it was people trying to scare me, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I reached the second floor, I realized that something much more sinister was going on. Strange marks covered the walls, deep scratches and symbols I had never seen before. Some looked like they had been carved with fingernails, others with something much sharper. My stomach churned at the sight, and the feeling of unease increased. The lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls, and I felt an evil presence watching me as if it were testing me. My flashlight began to fail, flickering on and off. Panic began to take hold of me, but I knew I had to keep going. The presence seemed to move with me, closer and closer. I decided that I needed to see for myself what was causing those sounds. I needed to understand what was happening in that damned building. As I investigated, I passed a series of closed doors, some locked, others simply leaning against them. At one of them, I felt an energy so negative that it almost made me faint. I took a deep breath and continued, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. But deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong, and that I might not come out of this experience unscathed. The moans were becoming unbearable. Now, they seemed to be coming from everywhere, echoing through the cold, empty corridors. Every step I took seemed to take me deeper into an endless nightmare. I decided it was time to investigate further. I needed to know where those sounds were coming from. What was causing them? I followed the sound to a point where the moans were louder. I stopped in front of an old, decayed door. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I opened the door carefully, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Scratch marks covered the walls, as if something or someone had fought desperately to get out. There were strange symbols, drawn with something dark, perhaps blood. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with an energy that made me want to run. The lights began to flicker more frequently, and I began to see shadows moving around the edges of my vision. They were fast, almost imperceptible, but they were definitely there. Every time I tried to focus on one, it disappeared, as if it was playing with me. My fear grew by the second, and the feeling of being watched was constant. My flashlight began to fail again, leaving me in the dark for seconds that seemed like eternities. It was then that I felt an evil presence, as if something was right behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing, just the empty, silent corridor, except for the moans that seemed to be laughing at me. The flashlight blinked once more, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw a shadow moving quickly towards me. My instinct was to run, but my legs seemed stuck. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I decided to move forward, convinced that I needed to understand what was going on. As I advanced through the corridors, the evil presence seemed to follow my every step like a shadow I couldn't see. I entered another room and was seized by an icy chill. There was something there, something that didn't belong in this world. I felt a shiver run up my spine when I saw an old diary on the floor, covered in dust and its pages yellowed by time. I picked it up with trembling hands and began to leaf through it. The words I read horrified me. They were accounts of macabre rituals, invocations of demons, and human sacrifices. The stories spoke of a demon that had been summoned there and had never been banished. At that moment, I realized that I was trapped in a real nightmare. The building wasn't just an abandoned site, it was a place where evil dwelled, and now I was trapped in it. The moans, the scratches, the shadows, it all made sense. The evil presence I felt was real, and it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The moans turned into screams of agony, echoing through the building like a chorus of tormented souls. Each sound seemed to cut through the air, penetrating deep into my bones. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was beating frantically. With every step, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen only increased. Suddenly, a metal door slammed shut with a deafening bang, isolating me on a specific floor. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I felt panic take hold of me. I was trapped. I looked around for a way out, but the corridors seemed darker and narrower. The shadows moved almost imperceptibly, creating grotesque shapes that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. I grabbed my communication radio and tried to call for help. The static took over and distorted voices began to come out of the handset. They were whispers, words that made no sense, but carried a malice that I couldn't explain. The radio failed completely, leaving me in absolute silence, broken only by the screams echoing in the distance. Desperate, I began to walk through the corridors looking for a way out. The lights flickered incessantly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Each time the light returned, I had the feeling that something was approaching, an evil presence that was reveling in my terror. I found another staircase and decided to go down, hoping to find an exit on the first floor. But with every step I descended, the feeling of evil increased. The cold was so intense that my bones ached, and the smell of mold and rot was almost unbearable. I finally reached the basement, where the darkness was almost total. My flashlight flickered, and with each flash, I saw shapes writhing in the shadows. In one corner, I found a makeshift altar, surrounded by unlit candles and symbols drawn on the floor with something dark. The walls were covered in handprints, as if someone had tried to escape. I felt a wave of despair and fear, but I knew I had to keep going. The evil presence was stronger there, as if this were its sanctuary. With each passing second, my mind was filled with horrible images. I saw disfigured faces, mutilated bodies, and eyes watching me from the shadows. The psychological terror was overwhelming. I tried to concentrate, but the feeling of being hunted was unbearable. I knew I was close to discovering the truth, but at the same time, I was afraid of what I might find. Suddenly, my flashlight went out completely. I stood in total darkness, surrounded by screams and whispers. I felt something cold and sticky touch my shoulder, and a shiver ran down my spine. My instincts told me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or think clearly. And it was at that moment that I realized that the real night of terror had only just begun. With the flashlight failing, I realized that I needed a reliable source of light. I rummaged through the basement until I found an old oil lamp. After several attempts, I managed to light it, spreading a dim but steady light around the room. The light revealed even more of the horrible symbols and marks on the walls, adding to the sense of dread. I took the old diary I had found earlier and sat down by the makeshift altar. The yellowed, fragile pages were full of disturbing stories. The diary belonged to someone who worked in the building decades ago when it was still in use. The first entries were ordinary, talking about the work routine and small day-to-day events. But as it progressed, the accounts became increasingly gloomy. The person who wrote the diary spoke of secret rituals carried out in the basement. Rituals to invoke something from the other side. The description of the rituals was graphic and detailed, full of symbolism and invocations. There were mentions of human sacrifices, carried out to bring a demon into our reality. The last diary entry ended abruptly, with a sentence that gave me chills. "He is here. We failed to control him." I felt a chill as I read those words. Everything made sense now. The screams, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. The demon they had summoned had never been banished. It was trapped in the building, waiting for new victims to feed its power. And I was exactly where it wanted me. As I read, the screams and moans around me got louder, as if they were reacting to what I was discovering. The atmosphere became colder, and I felt a presence approaching. I knew I needed to get out of there, but something was holding me back, a morbid curiosity that prevented me from letting go of the diary. I got up and continued to explore the basement, now knowing that each step brought me closer to the truth. On one of the walls, I saw old photos stuck up with rusty nails. They were of people who worked in the building, their faces full of life and smiles. But there was something wrong with the photos. The faces were scratched and disfigured, as if someone had tried to erase their identities. I felt a wave of despair as I realized that these people had probably been victims of the rituals. They were part of the sacrifice that had brought the demon into this world. And now, I was in the same position as them, trapped in a cycle of torment. The evil presence I felt intensified as if the demon was feeding off my fear. The shadows around the altar began to move, taking on almost human forms. I tried to move away, but my feet seemed glued to the ground. Panic was taking hold of me, but I knew I had to find a way to escape. Every second in the basement seemed like an eternity, and the feeling that something terrible was about to happen was unbearable. The demon was there, waiting, watching, and I was his next target. With my heart beating frantically, I knew that the only chance of survival was to get out of that damned building before it was too late. The screams turned into whispers calling my name. They were voices that seemed to come from everywhere, whispering with disturbing clarity. Every time I heard my name, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was as if the walls of the building were alive, wanting to consume me. I walked through the basement with the lamp trembling in my hands, trying to find the source of the voices. The shadows danced on the walls, creating grotesque shapes that seemed to follow me. I passed several locked doors, but one of them was ajar. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity overcame me. I slowly opened the door and stepped inside. I fought the sensation, trying to pull away. But it was hard to resist. The whispering of my name became louder, more insistent. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore the voices, but they were everywhere, inside my head, eating away at my sanity. When I opened my eyes again, I saw a shadowy figure reflected in the mirror, standing right behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Fear overtook me and I felt my heart racing. I knew I had to get out of that room before something worse happened. I ran to the door, but it slammed shut. I was trapped with the figure in the mirror coming closer and closer. Desperate, I looked for an alternative exit. The mirror was my only option. I took a deep breath and, with the lamp in one hand, threw a chair at the mirror. The shards fell to the floor, scattering everywhere. The figure disappeared, but the unease remained. I felt I was being watched by something invisible, something beyond my comprehension. I managed to open the door and ran out of the room, my heart still pounding in my chest. The corridor seemed longer and more tortuous, as if the building was trying to keep me trapped. The whispering died down, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I knew the demon was hunting me, waiting for me to make a mistake. With every step, the evil presence grew stronger. I tried to find a way out, but the building seemed like an endless labyrinth. Maze. I was tired, scared, and felt my strength was running out. But I knew I had to keep going. I had to find a way to escape before it was too late. Running through the dark corridors, I felt that time was running out. Each step echoed, amplifying my dread. The shadows seemed to come to life, moving in to grab me. I needed to find a way out, but the building seemed to change shape at every turn, turning into a nightmarish labyrinth. Finally, I found a staircase leading down to the first floor. I went down the steps 2 by 2, trying to ignore the sound of the whispers that followed me. When I reached the first floor, my hope grew. But as I turned a corner, I came across something even more disturbing. The doors, which should have led to the exit, were locked with thick, rusty chains. Trying to stay calm, I looked for another way out. As I walked, the corridors began to change. Doors that I was sure led to familiar places now opened onto unknown spaces, such as precipices or dark dungeons. In a moment of panic, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but I knew that something sinister was controlling the environment. It was as if the building had a life of its own, and that life was purely evil. The smell of sulfur and blood invaded the air, increasing my desperation. Every breath was an effort, the air heavy and suffocating. I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being pushed towards something horrible. My body was exhausted, my mind on the verge of collapse, but I couldn't stop. Not now. It was then that I found a room that looked like it had been an old meeting room. Inside, the mutilated bodies of former watchmen were scattered across the floor, in a state of advanced decomposition. The horror of this sight made my stomach turn, and I almost fainted. I recognized some of them, colleagues who had mysteriously disappeared over the years. The stories I had heard about the building and their disappearances now made sense. They had been victims, just like me. The room was covered in strange symbols, painted with what looked like dried blood. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but I knew that staying there wasn't an option. I ran out, trying not to think about the bodies and the fate that awaited me if I didn't manage to escape. Every corridor seemed to lead to a dead end. It was as if the building was toying with me, testing my limits. I began to feel a growing desperation, the feeling that I would never get out of that hell. The evil presence was almost palpable, as if it were within reach of my touch, ready to grab me and never let go. Finally, I found a window that led outside. It was locked, but I had no time to waste. I used the lamp to break the glass, and the sound of the break echoed down the corridor, mixing with the screams and whispers. I climbed through the window with difficulty, cutting myself on the shards of glass, but the pain was the least of my problems. I felt that at any moment something could pull me back in. With a lot of effort, I managed to get through the window and onto the ground outside. The cool night air was a relief, but the terror wasn't over. I knew that the building's evil presence wouldn't let me escape so easily. I started to run, feeling that something was still watching me from the shadows, waiting for the chance to catch me again. Running through the grounds of the abandoned building, my breathing was heavy and irregular. Fear pushed me to keep going, even when my legs begged for a rest. The silence of the night was full of invisible threats, and I knew that the building's evil presence would not be confined to its walls. Suddenly, I began to hear familiar voices. They whispered my name with disturbing clarity. They seemed to come from everywhere, calling out to me, drawing me into the darkest, most hidden parts of the grounds. Panic made me stop, look around, try to identify the source of the whispers, but there was nothing, just darkness. The voices intensified, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I knew they were hallucinations, but they were so real that it was hard to ignore. They spoke of horrible things, secrets I had never told anyone. The pain and suffering in the voices was palpable, and each word was a stab in my already fragile mental state. As I wandered the grounds, trying to escape the voices, I began to see hallucinations of my loved ones being tortured. My wife, my son, they were all there, in agony. I saw their faces contorted with pain, their cries for help tearing at my soul. It was an overwhelming psychological terror. My heart squeezed and tears streamed down my face. I knew it wasn't real, but the sight was unbearable. The demonic entity began to materialize in front of me. At first it was just an amorphous shadow, but it quickly took on a more defined form. It was a hideous figure, with eyes that looked like wells of darkness and a smile that showed razor-sharp teeth. It seemed to feed on my fear, growing stronger with every second I stood there, paralyzed. I felt an excruciating pain in my head, as if something was trying to enter my mind. It was a feeling of pressure, of something wanting to take control. My thoughts were confused, scrambled. I heard the demon's voice whispering terrible secrets, revealing things about myself that I wanted to forget. It seemed to know everything about me, every fear, every insecurity. My body trembled and the pain was unbearable. I tried to fight the feeling, but it was as if something was eating me up inside. I knew I needed to get away from that entity, but every movement felt drained of energy. The demon was tearing me apart piece by piece, taking advantage of my weakened state. In the midst of that terror, I felt an urge to survive. Something inside me, a primal will to live, made me take a step back, then another. With one last desperate effort, I started running again, trying to get away from the evil presence. The voices and visions continued to torment me, but I knew I couldn't stop. I had to find a way out of this nightmare before my mind and body surrendered completely. Running through the dark terrain, my panic increased with every step. Finally, I found a small building that looked like an old engine room. I entered, hoping to find some kind of refuge or at least a moment's respite. However, as soon as I closed the door behind me, the feeling of evil intensified. The air became heavier, almost impossible to breathe. In the center of the room, I felt a stronger presence than ever. The demon was there, waiting. The entity materialized completely in front of me, a hideous, deformed figure, as if it were the embodiment of all my nightmares. Its skin was gray and cracked, and its eyes were black pools of emptiness. The cruel smile revealed sharp teeth, as if it were delighting in my fear. The demon began to whisper terrible secrets about the building's past and its victims. It spoke of bloody rituals and sacrifices that had been made to summon it, revealing that those who had tried to control it had ended up as part of its eternal torment. The words were like blades, cutting through my sanity, feeding my terror. Each whisper made my mind fill with horrible images, of faces distorted by pain, of screams echoing in the darkness. The demon seemed to feed on my dread, growing in power and presence. The feeling of despair was overwhelming, as if every part of me was being drained of energy and will. I tried to fight it, to keep some control over my thoughts, but it was impossible. The pain was unbearable, as if my mind was being torn apart. I felt like I was on the verge of collapse, unable to distinguish between reality and illusion. The demon's voice was constant, relentless, whispering promises of pain and eternal torment. The demonic presence drew even closer, its monstrous form leaning over me. The surrounding darkness seemed to close in, as if the world was contracting, leaving only the demon and me. My body shook uncontrollably, and tears of pure despair streamed down my face. The terror was absolute, a force that crushed me inside and out. Every second I felt my sanity slipping away, the presence of the demon taking root in my mind. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness became total, and I felt like I was being pulled into an endless abyss. The last thing I heard was the demon's cruel laughter, a sound that echoed in the darkness as I descended into madness. The darkness enveloped me completely, as if the world had disappeared around me. The moans and whispers became an unbearable cacophony, and I felt the demon's presence intensify. My body was paralyzed with fear, and my mind was shattering under the weight of terror. My vision began to darken, and I felt a cold, relentless force pulling me down as if I were being dragged into a bottomless abyss. I tried to resist, but it was useless. My body and mind were too weak to fight. Everything around me became a mixture of shadows and screams, a nightmare from which I couldn't escape. Finally, when I thought I couldn't stand it any longer, the darkness became complete. The sound ceased, leaving an oppressive silence. I was alone, lost in absolute darkness. The demon's presence was palpable, like a shadow that completely enveloped me. I felt a cold, clammy hand touch my shoulder, and a shiver ran down my spine. I no longer had the strength to scream or resist. I just let myself go, knowing that my fate was sealed. Darkness consumed me, and I felt like I was being pulled into a place beyond comprehension, a place of eternal torment. When the presence finally departed, I was left in absolute silence. The building was completely silent, and the feeling of evil was gone. But I knew I wasn't safe. The demon had marked me, and I would never be the same. The marks on my body and mind were proof that I had survived an encounter with absolute evil. I walked through the building in a daze, not really knowing where I was going. The doors and corridors now seemed normal, as if nothing had happened. Finally, I found the exit and stumbled out of the building, feeling the cold night air on my face. But the relief was short-lived. I knew that evil was still there, lurking, waiting for its next victim. I never returned to the abandoned building, but the nightmares never left me. The images of the tortured faces, the whispers of the devil, the sheer terror, all of it was etched in my mind forever. And now, every time I see an abandoned building, I feel a shiver of fear, because I know that evil can be anywhere, waiting, watching. And so ends my story, a real horror story of an encounter with something beyond human comprehension. And although I came out of that night alive, a part of me was forever trapped in that building, in the clutches of the demon that dwells in the shadows.